A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year.
Dickens refers to food and drink over 5,000 times.
Dickens looked around him, I think, and looked at the extreme contrasts he could see in Victorian London at the time.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more.
None of the others have the fire of A Christmas Carol, and I think it's because A Christmas Carol was written with such an intention. It was written to change the world.
I think one of the things you've got to remember at this point is he's very conscious of who his audience are.
I think there's probably the sense that Turkey was a sort of goose on steroids. You know, it was the next best thing up.
I think the interesting thing about Dickens was he is a full-on performer.
Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
From the folding of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here. Look, look! Down here!" exclaimed the ghost. There were a boy and a girl, yellow, meagred, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out, menacing. No change, no degradation, no preservation of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation, has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children. The words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it," cried the spirit.
That scene, rather wonderfully read by Miriam Margolyes, the museum patron, it's quite harrowing. It is the scene Ignorance and Want, 2 children who are physically deformed by their poverty, and they're being revealed to Scrooge by the ghost of Christmas present. It's almost a strange scene. It's strange in that we think of A Christmas Carol as being a jovial, glorious, festive book, and yet here is this very stark, very harrowing image. But it's also where it's placed in the overall narrative of the story. Ignorance and want are revealed to us by the ghost of Christmas present, the ghost who of all the spirits is full of festivity and delight and joy and kindness, and yet he is the one that reveals one of the most harrowing moments in the story. To just explain for a moment what's going on in that scene. The boy is ignorance, the girl is want. They are, of course, both real children in that they are presented to Scrooge as human beings, but they are also metaphors. The girl being want. Want means deprivation, poverty, lack of basic necessities. Ignorance being not knowing love, not knowing decent education, not knowing how the world works. And what Dickens is saying when he says things like, on their brow man's doom is sealed, he's saying that if you allow ignorance and want in society, society cannot function. If a child is brought up in want and in ignorance, they are going to become the dangerous, angry grown-ups of tomorrow. And so in many ways, Dickens is saying, not only is there a moral duty to help children like ignorance and want, but there's also a practical duty too. Society will be better if we look after those at the bottom. For this episode of Inimitable, I want to look at this scene more closely. I want to know why Dickens wrote it. What was he trying to do with this scene? And what impact it had on his Victorian audiences. To begin at the beginning, I sat down with Dr. Lee Jackson, author of Dirty Old London, and an expert on the Victorian poor. I wanted to know, very simply, were these children real?
I think he's describing the worst cases of starvation and disease which could be seen in London. You wouldn't see those children on every corner, but Dickens, as we've discussed, explored the slums. He collared policemen and had them, guide him round the very worst parts of central London and its outskirts. And, the sort of diseases that were running rife, we've, I think, already touched on, especially the likes of digestive related problems, dysentery, diarrhea, basic stuff that could be absolutely devastating for people with no health care and often, no knowledge or ability to fix these things. You have to remember as well, also the communicable disease, pretty much all communicable disease in the 19th century, with the exception of vaccination for smallpox, there was no answer to. You just had to have it, and you would suffer. So there were children that were plagued by childhood diseases. There were children plagued by rickets, of course, famously. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Dickens would have seen such figures, if not every day. He wouldn't have walked down out of his house and immediately bumped into them, but he definitely would have seen them in the worst parts of London. And if you look at sort of cartoons in Punch, which is like this satirical magazine with a strong political intent of the problems of disease in the 19th century, they draw those figures. And again, they're pale, they're stretched, they're ghostly almost, claw-like hands. I think that's drawing from real life. I don't think it's a fantasy at all. Victorian London could be a disaster zone if you fell through all the cracks. The figures of ignorance and want are obviously this very didactic sort of little interlude in the book. We have the cheerful ghost, but then hiding under the good cheer this underlying the horrors of the 19th century, even beneath. It's ironic because Christmas Day is touted in the book as the one time that everyone nationally can come together and experience joy. But he says even underneath that, there's a hidden level of suffering. So I think he's trying to get people to pay attention.
It does bring a whole new layer to the appreciation of this book when you realise that those children are based on real children that Dickens would have seen. It's harrowing and poignant to read anyway, but to think of them as real children really does, in some ways, break the heart. I'm struck by the fact that children continually seem to be almost a trigger for Dickens. You think of Oliver Twist, think of young Pip in Great Expectations. There's something about the suffering of children which really invokes Dickens's rage. And I think a part of this must surely come from his own childhood when he experienced his own form of hardship. To find out more about Dickens's early life, I spoke to Dr. Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, curators at the Charles Dickens Museum.
Yeah, so what many people might not be aware of is that when Charles Dickens was only 11 years old, his his education was stopped. The family was sort of going in and out of debt, and they moved to London. And Charles Dickens was sent to work in a blacking factory. So this would have been a factory where he was putting labels on bottles of shoe polish near Charing Cross in today's world. And this was really a seminal moment in his life. He experienced real hardship. They were long days, 10-hour days, 6 days a week doing this work. And we later know he described it as, the rats running up and down the stairs. It wasn't a pleasant environment. And a few months later, his father, in fact, goes into debtor's prison, into the Marshalsea, which also enters Dickens' stories in Little Dorrit and in the form of Mr. Micawber, later in David Copperfield. So he has all this experience that really feeds his imagination. He knows what it is to be hungry. We've got accounts that he wrote about looking at the glorious cakes and buns on the streets, but he spends all his money on, and then maybe lives to regret it because he can't feed himself for the rest of the week. But he shockingly never talks about this in his lifetime. We only know about it later through the publication of the life of Charles Dickens by John Forster, one of his best friends, who he sort of writes an autobiographical account to, and near the end of his life, and Forster turns that into a biography.
It's a really interesting time because I think something that Dickens feels here is fear for his future. He is very worried about what's going to happen to him once he's taken out of education, once he can't finish his education. He does return to schooling, but he gets taken out again at 15 to go to work for the similar reasons. But also a huge sense of shame as well. And I think that empathy drives his stories forward. The blacking factory, of course, is something, as Emma said, he didn't publicly talk about, but you can't help but see it in his stories. Of course, it's in David Copperfield, it's the experience that he has. But equally, this idea of exploitation, child labour, hopelessness, children suffering at the hands of poverty is in a lot of his other works too. One of the sort of real favourites for that kind of neglected child is, of course, the character of Oliver Twist, which you can really see the suffering of innocence at the hands of poverty and others.
And he really linked in his mind child poverty with the lack of education for children as well. That was vital to him. And again, that comes from his own experience. He was always conscious of that.
I mean, I always think, kind of almost the fact that Dickens is such a renowned, famous writer and yet never finished school, essentially. But was he campaigned on a lot of issues. Did he campaign for universal education?
So he campaigned for the importance of education and education for all, whatever your income. So he was a huge supporter of different institutes throughout the country that offered education to different working class groups. And it is something that he truly believed in.
As a route out of poverty, I suppose.
Yeah. As a route out of poverty, as something that made us human. So you can enjoy all the wonderful things that you can when you can read and write and access that kind of culture. And also to give opportunity for, income and all those things that you need to be able to look after yourself.
So Dickens had his own experiences which helped shape his sense of deep sympathy and compassion for children who he saw suffering. And in part of that, again, I think is this sense of he knew what it was to be a hungry child. And he plays with food a lot, particularly in A Christmas Carol, as an emotional connection with the reader. To tell us a bit more about the relationship between food and power and suffering children, I spoke to Pen Vogler, food historian and academic advisor to the Dickens Museum, as well as Dr Cindy Sughrue, the museum director.
My theory is, and I think it's backed up by those with more knowledge, is that if you've ever experienced hunger, and Dickens did experience hunger in his childhood, you think a lot about food and you think about your next meal, but you also think about all those lovely things that one day you hope to have. So I think it's that experience of poverty at stages through his childhood that stay with him. Having access to food or not is one of the basic human needs. You think about, what do we need? We need a roof over our heads, enough to eat, someone to love, and something to look forward to. So it's one of those basic human needs. And Dickens also observes this, and he describes characters through the food they're eating, and their access to food and the quality of it. And I love in A Christmas Carol, one of my favourite descriptions is when the second of the three spirits that haunt Scrooge, the Ghost of Christmas Present, when he makes his entrance, he's seated on top of a huge pile of food. And this is how Dickens describes it. He says, heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch. It's just like almost awesome. You know, it's such a vivid description. All these lovely things that would be for the greatest tables and households, what you would serve up at Christmas time or any great feast and celebration. And in fact, in his 15 novels, Dickens refers to food and drink over 5,000 times. Yeah, and I've looked this up. There are 526 breakfasts, 49 lunches, 774 dinners, 298 suppers, and 42 feasts.
Wow.
Yeah, and food speaks of social class and personal circumstance, and it can capture the emotional essence of a situation because it's something that we all share, food. So in David Copperfield, he describes a very meagre dinner with the Micawbers, and he says, the fish were small and bony, and the potatoes were a little burnt. We all acknowledged that we felt something of a disappointment. And so that sort of sense of that's all you have, and you're kind of disappointed. But in happier times, of course, the Micawbers would celebrate. And so later in the novel, he says, we had a beautiful little dinner, quite an elegant dish of fish, the kidney end of a loin of veal roasted, fried sausage meat, a partridge and a pudding. There was wine and strong ale, and after dinner, Mrs. Micawber made us a bowl of hot punch.
Lovely. So punch is central to the piece.
But that sort of sense of, you know, it can just, without having to say, gosh, we were really poor and struggling, just the content of a dinner or a supper. And this is a constant feature throughout his writing.
One of the interesting things for me about the way that Dickens writes about food is that food never means one thing. It's very contextually determined. And so he'll write about a very loving feast between, in Our Mutual Friend, between Bella and John Harmon, where they just, and Pa, cherubic Pa, when they just have some milk and some bread. And it's a very simple meal, but it's blessed because of the situation. And the same when Nicholas Nickleby goes to visit his Yorkshire friend, and they're just having a simple, actually quite massive breakfast, but they're in the kitchen, not the parlour, and it's just a very joyous, very kind of happy occasion. And Dickens was quite mistrustful of high society dinners. And you look at some of the dinners in his books, which are really tense affairs. There's that horrible one where Mr. Dorrit, his wits, he's at a grand dinner, he's come into money, but his wits start wandering, and he starts to talk about the prison, the Marshalsea prison, and it's just horrible. It's uncomfortable, and you can see, those great big dinners, the Veneerings, very kind of grand dinners, which are really essentially very empty, and in Dombey and Son, the kind of massive wedding breakfast that celebrates, this very sham, loveless marriage. And so I think most of Dickens' happy times for food are much smaller, much more family oriented. And so the Christmas Carol dinner is really significant because they don't have very much. It's quite a small pudding for quite such a large family. But the shape of the pudding, going back to your question about the metaphor, the shape of the pudding is very interesting because it's sort of round, it's spherical, it kind of indicates something quite united. But it was very significant broadly because it was a time when Britain was becoming this kind of world power. Britain loved to see itself as the kind of global power. And the pudding becomes this kind of globe. It becomes an image of Britain's power in the world, as well as an image of domestic kind of security and bliss. So the Christmas pudding is quite a kind of iconic. It carries quite a lot of baggage, one little pudding, you know, in kind of emotional, psychological, but also kind of economic terms. And I think Dickens is probably aware of all that.
That's really interesting. Like, so intelligent, really, to pour in all these different metaphorical meanings. I think one of my favourite scenes actually is in The Chimes, the second Christmas book, where Trotty Veck is eating a dinner of tripe.
Tripe, yes, yes. And he's guessing, his daughter says, oh, guess what it is? And he's kind of, oh, is it, I can't remember what he guesses, it chitterlings or something, or sausages? And she goes, no, it's better than that, it's better than that. And he goes, oh my goodness, it's tripe, how fantastic. And the reader now goes, ugh.
Yeah, what is that?
He can make you see what is on each person's plate and how they feel about it and what it means to them. And he does this so brilliantly, going back to Pitt's sort of hideous Christmas when he's given all this food away to Magwitch and is just waiting to be discovered. And he describes this rather horrible meal where everybody, all he wants to do is to disappear. He wants nobody to pay any attention to him. And they insist on kind of making these very barbed comments about how fortunate he is and how his poor sister has to look after him. And clearly he's being quite mistreated, like many small children are in his novels. And the mistreatment, as so often happens in Dickens, is in given kind of inferior food. And for Pip, he says, I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowls, and with those obscure corners of pork of which the pig, when living, had the least reason to be vain. And I think that's just a wonderful way of kind of describing what children got for food, you know, and it could be worse than that. You know, we know that Squeers, for example, in Nicholas Nickleby, is supposed to be feeding these poor little kids, and he gives them each a swallow of water and milk while he tucks into sort of beef and bread. And so Dickens was very aware that food could withholding food was quite abusive, and he describes that.
I've always thought that, because I always think Dickens, it always strikes me that he was obviously, you know, a poor boy on the streets at one point in his life. He knew what it was to go hungry, and you really get this sense, particularly when he describes the Ghost of Christmas Present, this sheer sense of wonder at seeing all this food, but also I think the sense of feeling powerless when you're not getting your fair share, as it were. You know, you're vulnerable, aren't you? And I guess a lot of his readers probably would have known what it felt like to not be given a nice meal, but you've got to eat it regardless because that's all you're going to get.
The trick that Dickens does, that he's the first person, I think, to do this, is that he focuses on the child and the adults kind of melt away. And so when you see poor little Oliver Twist, you know, with his gruel desperately kind of licking the bowl clean, the adults are sort of there, but he's really showing you what's going on with the children. And poor Smike, you know, and sort of Nicholas Nickleby and the kids in that situation who are given literally brimstone and treacle to ruin their stomachs, to ruin their appetites. And he is showing readers who have their own children, you know, who love their own children, what it means for a child to not have security. And I think the thing that really, when I started kind of thinking about Dickens and food, the thing he really taught me was that food security for children means knowing where your next meal is coming from and knowing that it means it comes from somewhere or somebody who cares about you. And the fact that he didn't have that as a child himself, you know, when his dad went into the Marshalsea prison, his mother went in with him, with the younger kids, and he was left by himself. And that feeling of abandonment and hunger is so resonant throughout all his books, and we should think about it today.
Absolutely. You really start to see just why Dickens included ignorance and want in A Christmas Carol. They were real children. They existed in London in the 1840s, and he felt it important that people know that. they also play a useful role as a metaphor for the real problems which he felt rotted his society. But I wanted to find out a bit more about people's reaction to ignorance and want, and how Dickens thought it could change his readers. To find out a bit more about these children, I spoke to Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, author of Dickens and Christmas, and the 3 times great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens.
It's heart-rending to read. And if I see an adaptation that leaves it out, it makes me so cross. And a lot of adaptations, I think now they tend to be better. But earlier on, I think people thought, oh, it seems a bit depressing, we'll take it out. They were the children that Dickens wrote the whole book about. You cannot take out ignorance and want from an adaptation of A Christmas Carol. And anybody who's working on an adaptation, please don't leave it out, because it's the absolute essence of the story.
And I mean, that the saying, isn't it? You know, ignorance, of course, being, you know, you're not thinking, not caring, not understanding the world, and want, of course, being deprivation, suffering, lack of basic necessities. And the way the Ghost of Christmas Present says, on their brow man's doom is sealed. You know, if we have ignorance and want in society, we are doomed. That's what Dickens is saying. It's a very powerful message.
Saying it. And he says, you know, the boy is ignorance, the girl is want, beware them both, especially the boy.
Exactly.
And when I do talks, I go into schools quite a lot as a kind of visiting author, and I talk about A Christmas Carol quite often. And the boys will say, did Dickens not like boys? When I read that bit, I say, no, absolutely not the case. He loved children. The problem is that if you bring a child up in ignorance, and that is no fault of the child, allowing a children to grow up in ignorance of any goodness, and that includes, you know, being hugged by their parents, being loved, being taken care of, then you get the angry, violent adults of the future. They are the Bill Sykeses, the Fagins, the Daniel Quilps. They are all of Dickens's villains who've grown up to become the product of their angry, bitter childhood. And he even tells us in Oliver Twist, we know that Fagin was a child of the streets himself. We know that he had a terrible childhood, long before Sigmund Freud was talking about psychology.
And at a time when, of course, society was saying, if you're a Bill Sykes or a Fagin, if you're a criminal, then it's a moral failing. If you're a bad person, if you're in poverty, it's a moral failing. And of course, Dickens is saying, well, no, it's because they've been raised in ignorance.
Exactly.
I mean, he brings it home a lot more, doesn't he, in The Haunted Man? If you think about the child there that Redlaw sees, this kind of, again, physically deformed child who Dickens and the Ghost openly as saying, this is man's creation. You know, he really, it's like he takes A Christmas Carol and he strips out the niceness and the frivolity and he says, right, this is what I wanted to say all along.
It's so true. The Haunted Man is such a haunting book, and it is brilliant. And you have this little boy he's just a street child who has never been shown any kindness, so he doesn't understand what it is. He's just expecting almost to be kicked out the way like a dog. And he has to learn, if somebody shows him care, what that is. And we hear about this. We hear about terrifying stories from all around the world. I remember when I was little and people were talking about the Romanian orphanages, and I remember the terrible news reports on the BBC of these children who were not held, and the problems that were happening to children coming out of these orphanages, and that if you're not shown any physical care before, I think it's the age of about 3, your brain will never, ever accept it. I may have that age wrong, but I remember experts talking, saying, if a child isn't loved and cuddled and shown kindness, they can have, later in their life, all that love and affection, and they can't process it because they haven't had that in childhood. This is what that child is in The Haunted Man. It's a child who has been left on the streets to fend for itself. Perhaps his parents have died, perhaps they just couldn't keep him, but he is so angry and bitter. And Dickens would have known that from the time that he worked as a child labourer, when he walked down from Camden Town to work at the factory on the edge of the River Thames, and then he walked across the river to see his family in Southwark. Now that was a long walk from where he was living in Camden Town to where the Marshalsea prison was, with the stop in the middle. That direct route between those 2 points is 4 miles.
Wow.
And he was doing it there and back in a day and working for 10 hours. And he would have been seeing so many impoverished children. He knew that his life was bad, but it was nothing like as bad as these other children. And I think that's what makes Dickens' writing so amazing, particularly works like A Christmas Carol and The Haunted Man. They never, ever forgot what it was like to be a poor child. That's why Pip in Great Expectations and Oliver Twist and Little Nell in Old Curiosity Shop are so believable, because Dickens knew those children. They were real children that he'd encountered.
It's that raw humanity, isn't it, that just utterly transcends time.
Yes.
And I'm always struck, being here, I mean, we're sitting here in the drawing room at Doughty Street. 10 minutes down the road from us is the Foundling Hospital, which in Dickens's time, of course, would have been perhaps a slightly more respectable place than a lot of workhouses, but it certainly was somewhere where people abandoned their children, where mothers who couldn't keep their babies anymore would just leave them in the alcove to be taken in. I mean, he would have seen so much heartbreak and so much broken humanity on the streets every day. And he put that in his work constantly, didn't he?
He did. And I mean, Thomas Coram, who set up the Foundling Hospital, which was, 100 years or so before Dickens, he set it up because he came back as a sailor and witnessed corpses of children on the street, babies whose parents had left them perhaps outside a church, but they hadn't been discovered and they'd died of exposure. That was what prompted him to set up that hospital, or children's home. I mean, the term hospital was used in the terms of hospitality, because that was the scenario. If you were a young woman, perhaps got raped, perhaps was abandoned by her lover, and you had a job, you had to conceal your pregnancy, give birth in secret, or you would lose your job. They weren't being callous. It wasn't that they were saying, I'd rather have my job than a baby. It was, if I lose my job, I and the baby are going to starve. And so you hope that somebody else will give your child the life you can't. The desperation that Dickens witnessed was astonishing, and it was a very, very difficult time in which to live.
And that, of course, is seen, isn't it? You think about mother and baby in A Christmas Carol, after Jacob Marley appears to Scrooge, he goes and looks out on the street and he sees a mother and baby, doesn't he? And a ghost wailing because he wants to help them, but he can't. So again, it's all in there, isn't it? It's not, and it's not hidden. It's sort of a very blunt part of the story.
And I love those the ghosts who are kind of looking at the people they didn't help in life, and now they're wailing. That is their purgatory, isn't it? They are condemned forevermore to know that the people they walked past on the street that they didn't help, they're still there, and the ghost is going to have to see generations of this forevermore.
Yes. And it's that thing, isn't it? I think the line is something along the lines of that their pain was that they sought to do good for human matters in this world, but they'd lost that power forever. And I just think of that, and I just think Dickens is saying, isn't he, if you want to do good, do it now. Yeah. This is the chance you have. I always remember my father always used to say to me, you've got one life, don't waste it. And Dickens is saying that, you've got one life to help people. If you don't do it now, you can't.
Yeah, and that's what he wanted his readers to do. He wanted them to read A Christmas Carol, to read The Haunted Man, to read Oliver Twist, and think, oh, wow, I need to make a change. The chimney sweep in Oliver Twist who's, wants to take Oliver from the workhouse. And there's this throwaway line where Dickens says something like, he had already bruised to death 4 boys. And it's just in the middle of a paragraph. And that was the reality. That's what happened. So all those people who read Oliver Twist might perhaps, the next time the chimney sweep came, have a look. Perhaps the housekeeper would say, how's that boy? Maybe they might start thinking, gosh, we need to take care of these children. And it's the same with Joe the crossing sweeper in Bleak House. He is one of the most heart-rending characters in Dickens. This was wanting all these people who walked past in their finery and just expected a street child to sweep the street for them, probably didn't even tip them, but just expected it to be done as a matter of course because their dress was so beautiful they didn't want it to get dirty. And there was a child starving on the streets. The change from their purse could have fed them for a fortnight, but they probably weren't interested.
The figures of ignorance and want are really interesting. They are terrifying to read, heartbreaking. The fact that they're based on real children even more so. They represent a powerful contrast from the rest of the book. The rest of that scene even, in which the Ghost of Christmas Present is so fun and festive and joyful, and then suddenly you're confronted with this rather harrowing image. Personally, I think they're important for another reason. Scrooge was converted by the 3 supernatural ghosts. The Ghost of Christmas Past, the Ghost of Christmas Present, the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. He goes on that journey in which he is transformed. You and I don't have ghosts to guide us. But we do have this scene, ignorance and want. And to me, ignorance and want do to us what the ghosts did to Scrooge. The fact that this scene is so contrary to the rest of the stave. The fact that it's so stark, it leaps out at you, it captures your imagination, it makes you think twice. And that's exactly what Dickens wanted us to do as his readers. Once you've read the scene, Ignorance and Want, it's very hard to walk down the street and not notice those people who are suffering. And to my mind, that's exactly the impact Dickens wanted to have. In the next episode, I want to know about Dickens' politics. What was he trying to achieve with A Christmas Carol? And can he really be called a political figure?
Little Dorrit, where you have famously the Circumlocution Office as an office of state whose main job is to not get things done.
And it was natural for people to, oh, you should stand for Parliament.
The whole idea of the pen being mightier than the sword, absolutely true.
Inimitable is produced and presented by me, Jordan Evans-Hill. Our contributors are Dr Cindy Sughrue, Dr Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, as well as Dr Lee Jackson, Penn Vogler, Lucinda Hawksley, Miriam Margolyes and Simon Callow. Thanks for listening.